When a black businessman stepped into the first-class cabin, ticket in hand, his presence was not unusual, but the weight of stereotypes that followed him made the moment far heavier than it should have been. The truth is, stereotypes don't live in the words people say out loud, they live in the glances, in the hesitation, in the way someone clutches a bag tighter or questions whether you belong. From the very start, his polished suit, calm demeanor, and quiet confidence should have spoken for him. Yet for some, his skin color drowned out every other detail. This is the unseen weight that so many carry daily, a burden of being judged before being known, of having assumptions stitched into every move they make. It is the invisible luggage heavier than any suitcase, and unlike checked baggage, it cannot be set aside. Think about that moment in the plane. A man who paid for his seat, who earned his success through years of grit, was suddenly measured not by his achievements but by an image society had already written for him. People saw not the businessman, not the leader, not the figure of influence, but a stereotype shaped by centuries of bias. To some, the idea that he could afford, deserve, or even belong in first class seemed questionable. That silent questioning is what burns deepest. It is not shouted prejudice, it is the quiet disbelief, the raised eyebrow, the unspoken doubt that pierces deeper than words ever could. Stereotypes are not just surface-level judgments, they are shadows that follow individuals into every room, every meeting, every interaction. They creep into classrooms, where a child is told they are naturally less capable. They haunt workplaces, where promotion is delayed because someone doesn't look like leadership. They sit in airports and boardrooms, where a person's seat is treated as borrowed instead of earned. For the black businessman on that flight, the act of being told to leave his seat was not an isolated humiliation, it was the culmination of countless quiet dismissals that happened to people like him every single day. The unseen weight of stereotypes is more than emotional, it shapes opportunities, access, and even safety. It builds barriers where doors should be open. It creates glass ceilings so thick that even excellence cannot always break through. For the man on that plane, every eye watching him was not just seeing a passenger, they were seeing the echo of a narrative that was never his to begin with. And yet, stereotypes never tell the full story. They erase individuality, turning rich human complexity into flat assumptions. They rob people of the chance to be seen for who they are, replacing truth with caricature. In that moment, when airline staff insisted he move, the stereotype was speaking louder than logic. A ticket in his hand should have been proof enough. But stereotypes rarely care about proof. They thrive on doubt, on assumptions, on the belief that someone does not belong, no matter how clearly the evidence says otherwise. This weight is exhausting because it forces individuals to constantly prove their worth in spaces where others are accepted without question. It is a relentless demand to justify one's presence, a demand that drains energy, dignity, and peace of mind. Yet what makes this reality even more striking is how normalized it becomes. For many who witness such events, the thought is not shock but a silent shrug, because they, too, have absorbed the stereotype. They may not voice it, but they accept the storyline that whispers, first class is not for everyone, success is not expected from everyone, dignity is not equally distributed. This acceptance is what allows stereotypes to continue unchecked, to poison spaces where equality should be the foundation. For the businessman, his identity, once revealed, would shatter that narrative. But in that critical instant before anyone knew who he was, the stereotype carried more weight than truth. This shows how dangerous unseen prejudice can be. It creates realities that are false, yet they are acted upon as if they are true. The black businessman's story on that flight is not a rare exception, it is a mirror held up to society, reflecting the countless untold stories of others who are judged, dismissed, and underestimated simply because of who they are perceived to be. When airline staff asked the black businessman to step out of his seat, the words spoken were polite, wrapped in procedure, but the silence that followed from those around him carried a weight far heavier than the request itself. It is often said that prejudice is loud, filled with insults and anger, but in truth, some of the most painful acts of discrimination are carried out in silence. The passengers sitting nearby did not raise their voices, they did not intervene, they simply looked away. Some glanced with curiosity, others with quiet approval, and a few with discomfort they would not voice. This silence spoke louder than any words could, for it revealed the hidden agreement, the subtle endorsement of the act unfolding in front of them. Silent prejudice thrives in these moments. It is not always found in confrontation, but in the absence of resistance. It shows up when people allow injustice to pass unchecked because they fear speaking up, or worse, because they believe deep down that the injustice is somehow justified. When the businessman was asked to leave his first-class seat, the staff carried the burden of explicit action, but the passengers carried the burden of implicit consent. Their silence became complicity, and complicity is the soil in which discrimination grows strongest. This kind of prejudice is particularly powerful because it feels invisible. No one raises their voice, no one shouts, no one admits what they are thinking, yet the weight of it presses down harder than words. The businessman could feel it in the stares that lingered too long, in the way people shuffled uncomfortably but did not intervene. The silence told him that in the eyes of many, he did not belong there. And in that quiet judgment, he was reminded of the countless others who faced the same treatment every day in offices, schools, restaurants, and boardrooms, where silence from those who should speak up allows bias to pass as normal behavior. Silent prejudice is dangerous because it hides behind civility. It masks itself as neutrality, as if standing by is not taking a side. But when a person witnesses injustice and says nothing, they have already chosen a side. In that first-class cabin, the businessman did not just face airline staff enforcing a biased assumption, he faced the entire room of people who decided that their comfort, their peace, or their unwillingness to get involved mattered more than standing up for what was right. That silence weighed heavier than the words asking him to leave his seat, because it confirmed that no one would question the decision, no one would disrupt the unfairness, no one would defend his right to be there. This silence is not new. History is filled with moments where entire societies allowed injustice to thrive simply because too many people said nothing. The civil rights movement, the fight for equal pay, the demand for representation, all of these were delayed, not only by those actively opposing progress, but by those who stood quietly aside and let prejudice do its work. On that plane, silence acted as a chain, holding back justice just as powerfully as the spoken words of discrimination. The businessman felt the weight of that silence, and it was heavier than the humiliation of being asked to move. To be publicly dismissed is painful, but to see no one object, no one defend, no one even question, deepens the wound. It sends a message that the prejudice is not just in the heart of one person, but in the collective acceptance of many. That is the true cruelty of silent prejudice, it multiplies the harm by spreading it across an entire community of witnesses. And yet, silence is not neutral. It has power. It either protects the status quo or challenges it. In that cabin, the silence protected the prejudice. It allowed the airline staff to carry on without hesitation, knowing that no passenger would rise to challenge them. That silence became the stage on which the injustice played out, a stage built not just by the actions of a few but by the inaction of many. For the businessman, that moment was not about losing a seat, it was about confronting the unspoken reality that silence, more than words, can wound, exclude, and perpetuate a cycle of discrimination that thrives in the spaces where people refused to speak. When the airline staff insisted that the black businessman leave his first-class seat, they assumed they were speaking to just another passenger, someone who could be dismissed without consequence. What they never expected was that the man they were trying to humiliate carried an identity powerful enough to dismantle every false assumption made about him. Identity has a way of disrupting narratives built on prejudice. It has the power to remind people that their judgments are often shallow, incomplete, and rooted in stereotypes rather than truth. In that moment, when the truth of who this man was came to light, every whisper, every sideways glance, every act of silent prejudice began to unravel. The weight of false narratives was suddenly exposed for what it was, fragile and easily broken when confronted with reality. Identity is more than a name, more than a title, more than a position of influence. It is the accumulation of a lifetime of resilience, choices, and achievements. For the businessman, his identity was not something that could be erased by the doubts of strangers. It was built through years of persistence, through challenges faced and overcome, through a determination to succeed in a world that often expected him to fail. The airline staff and passengers saw only a black man in first class, but what they could not see, until it was revealed, was the story behind that presence. They could not see the boardrooms where he made decisions, the employees who depended on his leadership, the communities uplifted by his success. They could not see the sacrifices he had made to sit in that seat with legitimacy and pride. When his true identity emerged, it did more than just clear a misunderstanding. It shattered the carefully constructed stereotype that had been silently applied to him. Those who questioned his right to sit in first class suddenly had to face the uncomfortable reality that their assumptions were not only wrong, but deeply unjust. Identity in this sense becomes a weapon against false narratives, a force that challenges the unspoken belief that success, dignity, and worth are reserved for certain appearances or certain skin colors. The revelation of who he was stripped away the mask of prejudice and forced everyone to confront their own bias. But what makes this moment more powerful is that his identity did not change in that instant, it had always been the same. The only thing that changed was the awareness of those around him. Their perception shifted not because he became someone else, but because they were forced to recognize what had been true all along. This exposes the weakness of prejudice. It is not based on reality, but on assumption. And assumptions can crumble the moment truth steps into the light. The businessman's story shows how identity, once revealed, can disrupt and dismantle the false stories others try to write about you. There is also a deeper lesson in this. If it took the revelation of his professional success and influence to silence prejudice, then it reveals a painful truth about society. Too often, people are valued not simply for their humanity, but for their titles, their achievements, their power. While his identity as a successful businessman shattered the false narrative that day, it also begged the question, would his dignity have been defended if he were not a CEO, not a leader, not wealthy or influential? Identity should be enough simply because he is a person, a human being deserving of respect, regardless of status. And yet, the disruption of prejudice in that moment came because his identity exceeded the stereotype forced upon him. This is the double-edged reality of identity. On one side, it has the power to break through prejudice and demand respect by confronting false assumptions with undeniable truth. On the other side, it reveals how fragile society's idea of equality really is, because it often requires extraordinary achievement before respect is given. The businessman's identity forced the passengers and airline staff to re-evaluate their assumptions, but it also exposed the sad reality that many others, without such status, continue to be dismissed and silenced. Still, the power of identity to disrupt cannot be ignored. It reminds us that people are never what stereotypes reduce them to be. It reminds us that behind every face is a story unknown, a depth unseen, an identity far richer than quick judgments could ever capture. The black businessman did not walk into that plane as a symbol or a statement, he walked in as himself. But when his identity was revealed, he became both a mirror and a lesson, reflecting back the truth that prejudice is weak, and that the reality of who someone is will always outshine the false narratives imposed upon them. Respect is a currency that should never be tied to appearance, yet too often it is. The black businessman, dressed in a fine suit and carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had worked hard for his place, still found himself reduced to the shade of his skin rather than the weight of his achievements. That moment on the plane revealed a hard truth, that for many, respect is conditional. It is handed out selectively, depending on how closely someone fits into the boxes society has drawn. And yet, true respect should not be conditional at all. It should flow not from clothing, wealth, or status, but from the recognition of shared humanity. The passengers who watched him being asked to move were caught in this unspoken system of conditional respect. Some believed he did not belong because they could not picture a black man as someone who had earned first class. Others withheld respect until they knew his title, his background, his accomplishments. But respect that is tied to proof is not respect at all, it is prejudice dressed up as skepticism. It is the assumption that worth must be demonstrated, that dignity must be justified, that someone must earn the right to be treated as an equal. When respect is tied to appearance, it leads to a dangerous cycle. Those who fit the expected image are granted privileges without question, while those who do not are forced to explain themselves again and again. A white businessman in the same seat may have been assumed successful, capable, and deserving. But for this black businessman, the seat became a stage where his very legitimacy was put on trial. This uneven distribution of respect is not just unfair, it corrodes the very foundation of equality. It creates a world where some move freely, while others are constantly burdened with the weight of proving they belong. The truth is that respect rooted in appearance is fragile. It can be stripped away the moment someone fails to meet expectations. A change in clothing, a different accent, a hairstyle outside the norm, these small details become excuses for withdrawing the respect that should never have been conditional in the first place. That is why the businessman's story matters so deeply. It is not about whether he was wealthy or successful, but about the fact that his right to be respected should never have depended on those things. His humanity was enough. His existence was enough. Yet, in that cabin, it was treated as insufficient until his identity proved otherwise. We live in a world where image often becomes the first and sometimes the only measure of worth. Resumes are judged before interviews, faces are judged before voices are heard, and appearances are judged before stories are known. This is the injustice the businessman faced, not simply being told to leave his seat, but being told that his appearance did not align with the respect that seat symbolized. The flight staff saw him not as a valued customer, but as a mistake that needed to be corrected. And in that moment, appearance outweighed fairness, bias outweighed justice. Yet the irony is that appearance has never been a true reflection of a person's value. The greatest thinkers, the most compassionate leaders, the most resilient fighters in history were often dismissed because they did not fit the mold of respectability set by their societies. And still, they changed the world. The businessman in that first-class seat carried that same truth with him. His appearance may have triggered prejudice, but his story, his character, and his humanity were far more powerful than the shallow judgments cast upon him. This experience is a reminder that respect must be untethered from appearance. It must be given freely, not because someone looks successful, not because they wear the right clothes, not because their skin color fits society's expectation of success, but because every person is worthy of dignity. The businessman did not need to prove his wealth, his influence, or his leadership to earn respect in that moment. He needed only to be human. And yet, the conditional respect he faced exposed a painful truth, that in the eyes of many, humanity alone is still not enough. The act of asking him to move was not just about a seat. It was about society's ongoing struggle to see people as more than appearances. It was about the failure to recognize that respect is a basic right, not a privilege reserved for a chosen few. For the black businessman, the pain was not in being relocated, but in realizing that his appearance was still seen as insufficient proof of belonging in spaces he had more than earned a right to occupy. His story serves as both a warning and a call to action, that until respect is freed from the chains of appearance, the same injustice will continue to repeat itself in countless ways, in countless places, against countless people. When the black businessman was asked to leave his first-class seat, humiliation filled the air like a heavy fog, but what followed had the power to ripple far beyond that cabin. Acts of discrimination are never contained to the moment in which they happen. They carry consequences, they leave impressions, and they ignite reactions that can spread outward like waves in water. The ripple effect of standing against discrimination begins the moment one person chooses not to remain silent, when one act of courage sparks awareness, when one truth spoken disrupts the comfort of prejudice. That flight was not just a journey from one city to another, it became a moment that could challenge everyone present to rethink their place in a world where injustice still dares to raise its head. The businessman, by his very presence, was a symbol of resilience. To see him forced from his rightful seat was an act that offended dignity itself, but it also stirred something larger. For those passengers who looked on, the memory of that scene would not leave them quickly. Some would replay it later in silence, asking themselves why they did not intervene. Others would feel guilt for their quiet complicity. And a few, perhaps, would carry that memory as a seed that grew into a refusal to stand idle in the face of injustice again. The ripple began with discomfort, but discomfort has often been the soil from which change is born. When one person stands against discrimination, it sends a message far beyond the immediate setting. It tells others who have been silent that they are not alone. It tells those who suffer bias that they are seen. It tells the oppressor that their behavior is not normal and will not go unchallenged. In that first-class cabin, the businessman's dignity became an unspoken challenge to the prejudice he faced. Though humiliated in the moment, his identity and composure forced those around him to confront their assumptions. That confrontation was uncomfortable, but it was necessary, because nothing changes when prejudice is allowed to pass without disruption. The ripple effect does not stop with those who witness the act, it travels outward into families, workplaces, and communities. A child who hears their parent recount the story may learn to question bias earlier than they would have otherwise. A colleague who reflects on the injustice may become more intentional in offering equal respect at work. An airline staff member, chastened by the exposure of their prejudice, may think twice before repeating such actions. Each of these ripples is small, but together they form waves that erode the foundation of discrimination over time. The businessman's experience highlights the paradox of humiliation and resistance. On one hand, being forced to leave his seat was a moment designed to diminish him. On the other hand, by simply existing in that space, by returning dignity for disrespect, he created a scene that would outlive the flight itself. That is the ripple effect. When an attempt to silence someone instead amplifies their story, when an effort to belittle someone instead becomes a lesson carried far and wide. His humiliation was real, but the power of how he carried it transformed that moment into something much larger than a single act of bias. Discrimination tries to isolate. It seeks to make its victim feel alone, small, and powerless. But when people witness it and choose to speak, to share, to reflect, the act of isolation fails. The story spreads, the injustice is named, and the silence that gives prejudice strength begins to break. The businessman's story is proof that even in moments of deep unfairness, resistance is possible, and resistance is contagious. What begins as one man refusing to be defined by the prejudice against him becomes a collective realization that no one should be subjected to such treatment. The ripple effect also challenges institutions. When stories like this reach the public, they push airlines, companies, and organizations to reconsider their training, their values, and their policies. The businessman's experience was not just about him as an individual, but about the system that allowed prejudice to dictate behavior in the first place. By standing firm in his dignity, he became a catalyst for accountability, forcing larger conversations about equality in spaces where it is too often ignored. The ripples of one injustice, once exposed, have the power to create reforms that prevent countless others from experiencing the same humiliation. Every act of standing against discrimination, no matter how small, creates this kind of ripple. It may not always be visible, it may not always be immediate, but it spreads. Just as prejudice infects quietly, resistance heals quietly, growing from one person's choice to another's. The black businessman did not step on that plane to be a symbol, but when he was confronted with prejudice, his response carried a lesson that reached far beyond that cabin. His story traveled in whispers, in retellings, in reflections, and in those ripples lies the beginning of change. Transforming humiliation into a lesson for society is never an easy path, but it is often the path carved by those who have endured injustice with dignity. The black businessman, who found himself being asked to leave his rightful seat in first class, could have allowed the humiliation to define him. He could have chosen silence, carrying the weight of embarrassment alone, retreating into anger or shame. But humiliation, when confronted with resilience, can become something greater. It can become a mirror held up to society, forcing it to see its flaws, its failures, and its unfinished work. In that moment, the businessman's humiliation became more than personal, it became a lesson that stretched far beyond the confines of that airplane cabin. Humiliation has a way of silencing people, but it also has a way of exposing truth. For the passengers who watched the scene unfold, it was not only about one man losing a seat. It was about witnessing how fragile dignity can appear in the face of prejudice, and how quickly assumptions can strip someone of respect. But when the businessman's identity was revealed, and when the reality of who he was stood in stark contrast to the treatment he received, the humiliation that was meant to diminish him transformed into an undeniable spotlight on discrimination itself. Society could no longer look away, because the injustice was too clear to ignore. This transformation matters because it reveals a deeper truth: humiliation is not just about the person experiencing it, it is about the people and the system that inflict it. The businessman's humiliation did not speak to his worth, it spoke to the biases of those who judged him. It did not reveal his inadequacy, it revealed society's failure to uphold equality. In this way, the moment of humiliation became a lesson that exposed where change was most needed. It forced people to ask themselves why success and status must be proven before respect is granted, why dignity is too often conditional, and why prejudice is still allowed to shape decisions in spaces that should be neutral. The strength of the businessman lay not in avoiding humiliation, but in what he did with it. By maintaining his composure, by refusing to lash out or allow bitterness to consume him, he turned the humiliation into a form of teaching. Those around him were forced to confront not a stereotype, but a man of dignity. His calmness amplified the injustice, showing clearly that the problem was not him, but the assumptions made about him. In this way, humiliation became a stage for truth, a stage where prejudice revealed its weakness and where dignity showed its quiet strength. The lesson for society is clear: humiliation cannot destroy those who refuse to be defined by it, but it can destroy the illusions that prejudice tries to uphold. Each time a person endures injustice and responds with resilience, the mask of bias slips further. People are forced to see what they would rather ignore: that discrimination is not about the victim, but about the flawed systems and mindsets that allow it to exist. The businessman's story is powerful because it took what should have been a private wound and turned it into a public reckoning. His humiliation became a shared responsibility, a call for reflection and change. In many ways, the transformation of humiliation into a lesson is a continuation of a long history. From civil rights leaders who faced arrests and beatings, to everyday individuals who endured insults and exclusion, humiliation has been weaponized against those who dared to exist outside society's narrow expectations. Yet, time and again, those moments of degradation have been flipped into lessons that forced progress. The businessman's experience fits into this larger narrative, reminding us that humiliation is not the end of the story, it can be the spark that writes the next chapter. The true power of humiliation as a lesson lies in its ability to awaken empathy. Passengers who watched silently may later remember the sting of that injustice and recognize it in other situations. Strangers who hear the story may reflect on their own biases and begin to question them. Even institutions, when confronted with the public exposure of such acts, are compelled to change policies and practices. What began as one man's painful experience expands into a societal conversation, creating ripples that push for change. The businessman's ability to transform his humiliation into a lesson is what makes his story more than just an incident. It becomes a guidepost, a reminder that dignity can emerge even in the face of disrespect, and that society's greatest opportunities for growth often come from its most shameful moments. The humiliation he endured revealed the cracks in society's promise of equality, and by enduring it with grace, he turned those cracks into openings through which light could enter, forcing all who witnessed it to see what they might have otherwise ignored. Transforming humiliation into a lesson for society is never an easy path, but it is often the path carved by those who have endured injustice with dignity. The black businessman, who found himself being asked to leave his rightful seat in first class, could have allowed the humiliation to define him. He could have chosen silence, carrying the weight of embarrassment alone, retreating into anger or shame. But humiliation, when confronted with resilience, can become something greater. It can become a mirror held up to society, forcing it to see its flaws, its failures, and its unfinished work. In that moment, the businessman's humiliation became more than personal, it became a lesson that stretched far beyond the confines of that airplane cabin. Humiliation has a way of silencing people, but it also has a way of exposing truth. For the passengers who watched the scene unfold, it was not only about one man losing a seat. It was about witnessing how fragile dignity can appear in the face of prejudice, and how quickly assumptions can strip someone of respect. But when the businessman's identity was revealed, and when the reality of who he was stood in stark contrast to the treatment he received, the humiliation that was meant to diminish him transformed into an undeniable spotlight on discrimination itself. Society could no longer look away, because the injustice was too clear to ignore. This transformation matters because it reveals a deeper truth: humiliation is not just about the person experiencing it, it is about the people and the system that inflict it. The businessman's humiliation did not speak to his worth, it spoke to the biases of those who judged him. It did not reveal his inadequacy, it revealed society's failure to uphold equality. In this way, the moment of humiliation became a lesson that exposed where change was most needed. It forced people to ask themselves why success and status must be proven before respect is granted, why dignity is too often conditional, and why prejudice is still allowed to shape decisions in spaces that should be neutral. The strength of the businessman lay not in avoiding humiliation, but in what he did with it. By maintaining his composure, by refusing to lash out or allow bitterness to consume him, he turned the humiliation into a form of teaching. Those around him were forced to confront not a stereotype, but a man of dignity. His calmness amplified the injustice, showing clearly that the problem was not him, but the assumptions made about him. In this way, humiliation became a stage for truth, a stage where prejudice revealed its weakness and where dignity showed its quiet strength. The lesson for society is clear: humiliation cannot destroy those who refuse to be defined by it, but it can destroy the illusions that prejudice tries to uphold. Each time a person endures injustice and responds with resilience, the mask of bias slips further. People are forced to see what they would rather ignore: that discrimination is not about the victim, but about the flawed systems and mindsets that allow it to exist. The businessman's story is powerful because it took what should have been a private wound and turned it into a public reckoning. His humiliation became a shared responsibility, a call for reflection and change. In many ways, the transformation of humiliation into a lesson is a continuation of a long history. From civil rights leaders who faced arrests and beatings, to everyday individuals who endured insults and exclusion, humiliation has been weaponized against those who dared to exist outside society's narrow expectations. Yet, time and again, those moments of degradation have been flipped into lessons that forced progress. The businessman's experience fits into this larger narrative, reminding us that humiliation is not the end of the story, it can be the spark that writes the next chapter. The true power of humiliation as a lesson lies in its ability to awaken empathy. Passengers who watched silently may later remember the sting of that injustice and recognize it in other situations. Strangers who hear the story may reflect on their own biases and begin to question them. Even institutions, when confronted with the public exposure of such acts, are compelled to change policies and practices. What began as one man's painful experience expands into a societal conversation, creating ripples that push for change. The businessman's ability to transform his humiliation into a lesson is what makes his story more than just an incident. It becomes a guidepost, a reminder that dignity can emerge even in the face of disrespect, and that society's greatest opportunities for growth often come from its most shameful moments. The humiliation he endured revealed the cracks in society's promise of equality, and by enduring it with grace, he turned those cracks into openings through which light could enter, forcing all who witnessed it to see what they might have otherwise ignored.